So welcome everybody to this new episode of the series New Frontier for Human Rights. I'm really pleased to be here tonight to work with you around the concept, the idea, the work that is done around the right to development. We have a very high-level panel that soon I will introduce to you. But first of all, just a few housekeeping noticed. So you can at any moment post a question on the chat of the YouTube channel that is live streaming this event, and our colleagues will forward to us the questions, so feel free to interact this way with each one of us. And I think for the sake of time, we can start now. Since right to development is a really maybe for some of you a new concept, a new idea, we thought that it could be interesting to place it into the space of this new frontier from human rights. So 2013, the year we are now, is a midpoint of the 15 years period that envisaged to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The target, the goals that were placed as by the United Nations in September 2015 as the goals for the member states. The implementation of the Sustainable Development Goal represent a great opportunity for the operationalization of the right to development. The right to development was proclaimed in the Declaration on the Right to Development, adopted already in 1986, by the United Nations General Assembly. This declaration was then recognized in other regional charters and is the base for an equitable approach to development. The declaration states that the member states have the primary responsibility for the creation of national and international conditions favorable to the realization of the right to development. To support and monitor the implementation of the right to development, as per the declaration, an open-ended working group on the matter was established in 1998. The working group meets once a year and report directly to the Human Rights Council. From 2004 to 2010, the working group was supported by a high-level task force composed by 5 independent experts, and the idea was to advise the group with providing at least a set of criteria and operational sub-criteria for the implementation of the right to development. In 2019, an expert mechanism on the right to development was established. The expert mechanism was designed to offer thematic expertise on the topic of right to development and identifying and suggested best practices to promote this right worldwide. The expert mechanism meets twice a year and is based in Geneva and New York, and submit an annual report to the Human Rights Council. In 2019, the Council required the chair rapporteur of the working group to submit a draft legally binding instrument that support the states in fulfilling the requirement of promoting right to development. Follow this request, drafting group with 5 experts in the field of international law was created. And among them, and as a chair, Professor Mihir Kanade was required to support. I think we will have time to go into the details of this journey that took to the draft covenant. But during the 54th session of the Human Rights Council in June this year, a draft covenant on the right to development was presented with the recommendation of the General Assembly to create an international conference where the international legal binding instrument to support right to development could be promoted and designed soon. So after this really brief introduction, I think we can introduce our speakers. I will start, if it's fine with Shyami, by introducing her. So Dr. Shyami Puvimansinghe is a human rights officer at the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, in Switzerland. She supports the mandate on the right to development, international cooperation, and the social forum. She was previously a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law at the University of Colombo in Sri Lanka, and worked with non-governmental organizations in Gaborone and in Botswana. As lawyers of the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka, Shyami holds a LLB from the University of Colombo and an LLM at the Harvard Law School in the US, and a PhD in development study from the International Institute of Social Studies in the Netherlands. Her publication include a book, Foreign Instrument, Human Rights and Environment, a perspective from South Asia and the role of public international law for development. This is the title. Several other articles on the sustainable development and obviously on international solidarity, right to development, and cooperation, economic, social, and environment justice globally and in South Asia. So you see a very rich background that allow me to ask you, Shyami, a question that may help us to get to know a bit more how you approach what is your how would you define right to development and what getting involved and work on right to development means for you. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David, and thank you so much for organizing, to all the organizers, all the universities and New Humanity for organizing this webinar, which is very timely and topical. And what does the right to development mean to me? Well, in the Declaration on the Right to Development, it makes development itself a human right. So development becomes a human right of all individuals and all peoples, everyone, everywhere, in other words, enabling people to whatever their situation in life, whatever their gender, whatever the country of their nationality, whatever their economic status, and irrespective of all differences, to contribute to, enjoy, and benefit from, and participate from in development. With two key principles, the fair distribution of the benefits of development and the free enabling everyone to free, active, and meaningful participation in development at all levels. This is the right to development takes us to all levels of governance. So unlike most of the time, we are looking at the national level only. This human right takes us beyond that national level. It keeps us grounded at the national level, but then makes us look at the connections between development, human rights, peace, and security. That is the 3 pillars of the United Nations Charter. It brings all of these together and enables everyone to participate in development. And development, again, is defined or described in the declaration as in a very holistic way, a very comprehensive way, a very multidimensional way, so that it's not at all about GDP growth. Of course, it is about GDP growth as one aspect, one very important aspect of development, but there is so much more to it. So if a country is having, very big GDP growth, but most of the people are living below the poverty line, that is not the right to development. If people of a minority community are being discriminated within that, development process and outcome, that is not the right to development. So Article 7, I think, is particularly important at this point of time when we are feeling the impacts of war all around us. The call to disarmament, the right to development calls for disarmament and the use of the savings from disarmament to feed people, to feed the hungry. In the days of the MDGs, I read an article called Shooting Down the MDGs, and now we are shooting down the SDGs, right? So like you wanted a more a personal level resonation as well, where before joining the United Nations, I was an academic, like you said, as well as an activist. And I didn't know about the right to development. Honestly, I did my whole thesis looking at development, environment, human rights, all of these connections, but I was not very familiar with the right to development. Having joined the office, I discovered this right and I realized how much sense it made, how much it resonates with everything that I wanted to do, all of my academic and activist endeavors. It was about looking at that holistic nature of trying to improve through academic and activist endeavors, the lives of people. But here was a human right, little implemented, but a lot has happened, as we will see in the United Nations. We will see that later. So it really resonates. It really speaks to me. And also at even a more personal basis, not the professional, but really, coming from where I am coming from, an island nation, Sri Lanka, a colony up to 1948, with all the economic problems of most post-colonial countries in Africa, in Asia, and also earlier in Latin America. This right speaks to me very much. Also that we are living in a globalized world. So maybe we are not, colonization is less now, so to speak, but there is globalization, which means trade, investment, debt, all of this is making a daily impact on the lives of everyday people and their lives, their jobs, etc. So in that sense, it really speaks to me. Also the fact that my country was 27 years in civil war and now in a hopefully transitional justice, or in a pursuit of peace, or and so on. And in all of these realities, the right to development, it seems to be one human right that can bring all of these different things together. And more recently, after COVID, we saw all the collapse of many countries, especially in the global south, in the COVID, and then the resurgence from COVID. Some of us have been left completely in debt due to national factors as well as international factors, and a combination of all of them. There's many factors of governance at national as well as international levels. Now with loans from international institutions and the conditionalities they bring, so it seems like I can resonate, and the right to development resonates completely with me. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, because I think this is the perfect introduction to understand more the depth and the breadth of right to development, and how much this is a right, a human right that really impacts people's life, especially in those countries that experience development link to history that of colonization and of inequalities. Allow me to introduce you now the second speaker, Professor Mihir Kanade. Is an author and professor of international law and human rights at the development at the University for Peace. That is an international treaty-based organization and institution of higher education established by the United Nations General Assembly in 1980. He holds the current position of the academic coordinator for the University of Peace since 2016. Is the head of the Department of International Law since 2014 and the director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Peace since 2009. Prof. Kanade is best known for his contribution to the promotion of the right to development. He's the chair of the drafting group appointed by the Office of United Nations for the draft of the zero draft of the legally binding instrument, as I mentioned before. And from March 2020, he was elected by the United Nations Human Rights Council, a member of the expert mechanism on the right to development, representing the Asia-Pacific region. The Human Rights Council renewed his mandate for another 3 years in April 2023. So, thank you for joining us today, Mihir. And I see from your profile that you work in human rights in a broader sense, but that at a certain point you start focusing your interest and your academic professional attention on the right to development. What motivated you on focusing your attention on the right to development?
Thank you very much, Davide, and thank you everyone for the kind invitation to share my thoughts and opinions today on the right to development. Well, it's a very interesting question, and I often reflect upon where I started on the journey of right to development and its promotion. And I often find parallels in my journey with Shyami's journey. I also began as a lawyer in the Supreme Court of India. I practiced for many years. And part of my work that I was doing was also related to international trade. At least that was my interest. And then in 2007, a research project opened up at the United Nations University in Tokyo, which is our sister organization, on international trade and development. And my particular focus happened to be on the multilateral trading system and human rights. And it was a time when the multilateral trading system under the World Trade Organization was being critiqued quite a lot from all quarters. In fact, there was an early report from the United Nations Human Rights System, which called the WTO as a veritable nightmare for human rights. And so, that was the political and the academic environment within which I started to look into what could be the possible solutions towards harmonizing the WTO law and human rights law. Now, there was a problem in doing so because the WTO jurisprudence at the time was very problematic, because it promoted an idea that WTO law was self-contained, that you couldn't read in human rights obligations under the human rights treaties into WTO law, because that would then add to or diminish the rights and obligations of states under the WTO law. So they often proceeded on the basis that human rights obligations are extraneous to WTO law, and therefore you couldn't actually read them into the jurisprudence. And so I had to actually find an argument which was intrinsic to the WTO agreements itself to overcome the logic that somehow human rights are excluded by WTO law and they are extraneous. So I needed to find an internal argument within the WTO instruments. And I then looked closely at the WTO's institutional agreement, the agreement establishing the WTO, also referred to as the Marrakesh Agreement. And in its preamble, I noted that actually free trade is not referred to as the objective of the WTO. The objective in the preamble of the constitution of the WTO comprises things such as higher standards of living, full employment, and guess what? Sustainable development. That's the institutional objective of the WTO. Free trade is merely assumed to be the right template to reach those institutional objectives of sustainable development, etc. Now, of course, that gave me a very good legal platform to contend that sustainable development, if it is the institutional objective of the WTO, cannot be realized if development itself is unsustainable, or if it violates human rights, because you can't really have sustainable development if it violates the social pillar, right, where human rights come in. Now, it's at that point that I stumbled upon the right to development, and this is really 2007, as Shyami did in her course of work as well. And right to development then immediately, bounced at me as the most appropriate framework to look at in the context of multilateral trade and human rights, but also more broadly in the context of globalization and human rights, a point that was previously mentioned by Shyami. Because a central tenet of the right to development's normative framework is an understanding that no state can realize development or sustainable development on its own. While realization of development does require an enabling national environment, it also requires an enabling international environment. Because many disciplines of international law, whether we talk about WTO law, whether we talk about the IMF, the World Bank, the International Monetary System, financial system, they all do empirically create what we call a limiting environment for states to determine their own development priorities, which involve the people and their interests, and then actually implement them. Conditionalities of the IMF, World Bank are very well known. We know the limiting environment created by the WTO, for instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when intellectual property rights restrictions were not lifted. And these are all part and parcel of the international disciplines. Now, I just, if you permit me, in 3 or 4 minutes, I'd like to explain why, for me, the right to development's normative framework appeals so much. As Shyami pointed out, development in the 1986 declaration is not described in economic terms, right? It's not GDP or GDP per capita. A point, by the way, which 12 years later, Amartya Sen, the economist, said in his book, Development as Freedom, which is nothing but a re-articulation of development as human rights, development as freedom. He said exactly the same things that the 1986 declaration said, that development is about well-being, it's about enhancement of our well-being, it's not only about economic growth, and then won the Nobel Prize in economics. But the human rights system had said exactly the same thing 12 years earlier in 1986, where development is described as a comprehensive economic, social, cultural, and political process that aims at the constant improvement of the well-being of all individuals and peoples. Today, we say all individuals and peoples. We have, this fancy term today in the 2030 agenda, leaving no one behind principle. That was exactly said in 1986 in this declaration, pretty much the same thing, which involves the active, free, and meaningful participation of all individuals and peoples, and the fair distribution of benefits resulting therefrom. Now, what the 1986 declaration does is that it focuses on self-determined development of the rights holders. The rights holders are individuals and peoples. It's both an individual right and a collective right. So who is the author of what development means? It is the rights holders who determine what development means to them. It is their development priorities that are to be taken into account when we talk about development as a human right. It's not a state right, it's a human right. It's the right of human beings and peoples to determine what development means to them. And it's the obligation of the state and the international community then to facilitate the realization of that self-determined development. I noted from Davide, I noted from the the flyer that you had produced that there's some debate on the content of the right to development. There are some critiques that it is vague, and I've often said that a lot of those critiques come from a very biased perspective, from an academic lens, which does not want to let's say, destabilize the existing status quo. At the end of the day, the right to development is disruptive of the existing status quo. It challenges the lopsided nature of the international economic and social order. But if you pay attention to Article 1 of the 1986 Declaration, it's very clear that the right to development is a self-standing human right which entitles human beings and peoples to three things. It's very clear: the right to participate in, the right to contribute to, and the right to enjoy development. Now, a violation of any of these three elements, the right to participate in, such as consultation not done, development priorities decided by the state or by the IMF without participation of the people, or the right to contribute to, violation of the right to contribute to development. For instance, we have often seen road projects taking place, but there's no local employment, right? The right to contribute to, or the right to enjoy development, and violation of the right to enjoy development on an equal footing would occur when there's discrimination based on ethnic grounds, religious grounds, gender grounds, urban, rural grounds, etc. But what Article 1 also goes on to say is that when we conceive of development as a human right, it is not development that comes at the cost of other human rights. It defines development as a human right as something which permits the realization of all other human rights. In other words, you cannot call a project as enhancing the right to development if it violates other human rights. There is no trade-off permitted in the context of the right to development. So it's very clear, if we only want to pay enough attention to what's said in the 1986 Declaration, there is no vagueness whatsoever about it. And of course, the draft covenant would go on in elaborating a lot more on this aspect. Now, in closing, in my opening remarks, I would just say one more thing, that where the value added of the right to development comes in is in the three levels of obligations of states. Typically, if you look at all other human rights, particularly from a Eurocentric perspective, and I'll develop on this argument a bit later when we have the opportunity in the second round of questions. The dominant narratives of human rights focus predominantly on human rights obligations of states internally, within their own jurisdictions. What the right to development says is that there are three levels of obligations, each of which are equally important, because this right cannot be realized unless there is an enabling national and international environment. So the three levels are internal obligations of states, external or extraterritorial obligations of states, so don't take national measures which violate the right to development of those elsewhere. And number three, the collective obligations of states when they act in regional and global partnerships. These three levels of obligations are given equal weight under the right to development's normative framework, which is one of the biggest value added of this. And of course, you can imagine then when we look at trade, when we look at globalization and its impacts on human rights, this extraterritorial and collective dimension of obligations adds a tremendous value to try to resolve some of these tensions that exist. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for presenting so extensively and clearly. I have to say, one of the fascinating bit that I share with you both about approaching right to development when I start being interested in this, it was exactly these possibility of incorporating different levels, incorporating the proactive participation and the requirement, the obligations at different levels that in some way made clear, as you perfectly expressed, that the right to development can represent a summary, a base, a good incentive to look at the other right and work collectively together to guarantee in a participatory way the development of the peoples and the nations. With these, I think we perfectly introduce Mara as the next speaker, because she brings us a perspective that is the perspective of someone that works worked for many years in the field. She's the main representative of the Associazione Papa Giovanni XXIII at the UN in Geneva since 2019. She holds a degree in medicine and a specialty in infectious diseases from the University of Bologna. A diploma in tropical medicine at and hygiene at the Royal School of Tropical Medicine, and a master in public health at the Prince Leopold Institute of Antwerp. She worked as medical doctor for the Diocese of Ndola in Zambia for 20 years, from 1988 to 2008. She served as medical advisor of the Red Cross for the Ndola branch for 2 years. From 1994 and 1998, she worked as assistant AIDS coordinator at the AIDS department of the Diocese of Ndola, and she took over the role of AIDS coordinator for the same program. From 2002 to 2008, she worked at the XXIII Youth Project. Her research was focused mainly on HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. At the UN, Mara advocates inter alia for the so-called solidarity rights, such as the right to peace, the right to development, and the right to international solidarity. What I think I want to ask you, Mara, is coming from an environment where the impact of granting right to development is visible in people's life. What would you say it means right to development for you?
Thanks, Davide, and thanks for this invitation to participate in this important webinar. As you said, I'm a member of the Association Community Pope John XXIII since I was very young, and our association is present in 45 countries all over the world, on the 5 continents, both in developing and developed countries. But we see in all these countries how crucial it is really the implementation, the realization of the right to development in order to overcome those national and international obstacles that are really root causes of the increasing inequities, inequalities in the world, of extreme poverty, of the food crisis, and also of the climate change crisis that we are facing. So, having been for 20 years in Zambia, when I was there, I even didn't know at all about the right to development, I tell you, as Shyami was saying before. But I saw what does it mean, the lack of the implementation of the right to development in many, many ways. I can give you full range of examples that will be not having end, from the people starving, for the malnourished children. When I was the AIDS coordinator in the Catholic Diocese of Ndola of a huge home care programs with more than 12,000 patients registered and their families. This was in the era that still the antiretrovirals were not available. Antiretrovirals have been a great scientific progress, but for many years were just available for the rich countries and the rich peoples because of the cost, excessive cost, because there was no production of generics. So I've seen for years my patients dying after 2-3 years. There were a role in our program where we were giving quality of care for what we could, treating the opportunistic disease and so on, but knowing very well that without these drugs, after 2-3 years, they were all dying as they did. And I lived the suffering with them, you know, the impotency of making their life different. When the antiretroviral came, thanks to international cooperation, thanks to the Global Fund and so on, the life of my patient changed dramatically, becoming a chronic disease to deal with. This is just an example of what does it mean. But why? There were obstacles to it. And there are still these obstacles to it, because if this external help will finish, will end, because it's still optional, you know, what does it mean for all the patients that have HIV/AIDS in Sub-Saharan Africa? They will go back to die, because the health system, the government of a developing country like that one, or many others in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, cannot afford still to have also all the generic drugs, the production in loco of these drugs. Another example, I've seen the tragic choice that the mothers have to make with the little money they have, either to use it to bring their child who is sick at the clinic, or to use it to feed the other children at home. And this is a scandal. I mean, the extreme poverty of the shanty compounds where I operated for many, many years, you know, are really a cry, the cry of the poor. Now there is also the cry of the heirs as well, for the right to development, as Pope Francis says. So when I came to Geneva as a main representative at the United Nations of my association, then I discovered, through the lens of international solidarity, that was the first mandate that we were supporting, that there was the right to development. And I started to study deeply this right, unknown to me. Unfortunately, is unknown to many people still in the world, but which is a revolutionary tool. Because really the right to development is a right of individuals and people to participate in, contribute to, and benefits of the enjoyment of a comprehensive development, economic, political, social, and cultural. It lacks the word spiritual that we try to bring also here at the United Nations. We have seen that, first of all, is really a right that is so close also to the concept of the integral development of the social teaching of the Church, of the Populorum Progressio, of the Pacem in Terris, of all the encyclica of our popes on the Catholic point of view. But apart this one, it's really a revolutionary tool which realize, if implemented, the link between the three pillars of the United Nations, which are human rights, development, and peace and security. And it is also an important tool because it affirms a comprehensive, people-centered, and participatory development, where people, individuals, according to their context, to the situation in which they live, can be protagonists of their own development. The right to development shifts also international cooperation from an optional, even if in the United Nations law is not optional, because Article 55 and Article 56 of the United Nations Charter clearly say the duty to cooperate and so on. But still Western countries, powerful, rich countries, wealthy countries, think that it should remain an option. And this is one of the big obstacles to recognize fully the right to development. The right to development instead shift the paradigm of international cooperation from a perspective of charity and moral obligation to an affirmation of solidarity and of social justice. So this is crucial. As Shyami was also saying, Article 7 of the Declaration on the Right to Development which was adopted in 1986, says very clearly that member states should aim at this complete disarmament and to give the money spared by not buying weapons to social investment, to social protection floors, and so on. So, I mean, it's really a right that encompasses all the other human rights, as Mihir was saying, but can advance really the life and making an impact on the life of people if really implemented. Of course, shouldn't be taken in isolation. And for example, the 1986 declaration is the first UN, if I'm correct, Mihir, you can, and Shyami, you can correct me, is the first document that affirms the indivisibility, inalienability, interdependence of the human rights, even before the Vienna Declaration that happened in 1993, which reaffirmed the right to development unanimously, while in 1986 it was voted by the majority of states, but the United States opposed to it, and 8 states abstained, you know? So really for us it's very important. What we are expecting for the implementation of the right to development, that the social determinant of health can be really addressed seriously, that the health system will be strengthened, that external debt will be cancelled for those countries that cannot afford and where the debt is really unequal, you know. We expect that international cooperation can be applied without conditionalities. I've seen what did it mean, the structural adjustment programs in Zambia in the time I was there, you know? So for all these reasons, I don't want to be long, but this is the practical aspect for what I've experienced for many, many years. And we try to bring this here at the United Nations, being voice of the voiceless for what we can. But I think that something we have obtained throughout the years.
Yes, and
the
thank
draft
you.
international covenant is a very important step.
Exactly. I thank you very much, because I think we work together side by side, try to translate the life of the people that have no voice into juridical terms, into suggesting revisions as a civil society. So I've experienced how important is the work of civil society. This first round was supposed to be much shorter, but it was extremely interesting and informative, and also passionate. So this is what I like, that the reason behind your choice to work on it emerged. So this is important, I think, for everybody that is listening. If you promise me to stay within 3-4 minutes, no more, for your second round of answer, I will go straight to more to questions that are more related to your role within the universe of right to development. So I will go back to Shyami, and I will. We met at the working group on the right to development almost 10 years ago with Shyami, and you grew together with the right to development in your professional and personal life in this decade. Can you tell how the effort on the right to development by the United Nations changed and evolved over time? You're muted, sorry.
Thank you so much, David. So I think the right to development was, in fact, there even a long time before the 1986 declaration, going back to the setting up of the establishment of the United Nations in 1945 and the UN Charter, and talking about, now we heard a lot about the role of civil society from Mara, from David. So the first 3 words of that charter are "we the peoples." So when we the peoples took a resolution, they resolved to make a better standard of life for all of humanity, to make, irrespective of whether nations were large or small, for men and women, for all countries, for everyone, right? So the charter already had this resolve to solve international problems through international cooperation, global problems through international cooperation. And those are the very seeds of the right to development. Then comes the 1948 Universal Declaration, especially Article 1. All people are born equal in dignity and rights, and are endowed with reason and conscience, and should behave or treat each other with solidarity, with brotherhood, with sisterhood. Then to the two covenants in civil and political and economic, social and cultural, bringing the different forms of rights. And then, as Maria said, of course, a lot of other things happen in between, but you said 3 to 4 minutes, so I'm going fast. The 1986 declaration, in fact, I agree, Maria, that was the first attempt to really explicitly see everything together: civil and political rights, economic, social, cultural rights, development, human rights, peace, national and international dimensions. Really, so the word is, I think, integration, that integral development, looking at everything as part and parcel of one single process and outcome. Then, of course, Vienna Declaration and Program of Action said, that the right to development is a human right like all others. It was universally accepted there. And all of this, because you asked me about the role of the United Nations. Well, it was because of the United Nations that we had all these developments, this trajectory, step by step by step. And following Vienna, our office was set up, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in 1993. And a core part of the High Commissioner's mandate is to promote and protect the realization of the right to development. And that relates back to some of the work I do, because I and together with all my colleagues, we try to mainstream the right to development. We try to bring it into development policies at the national and international level, to trade and investment, to debt relief, and all the different economic arrangements at the national as well as the international level. And it is no easy task. It is really a struggle. And, we are talking, I don't like to talk about generations of human rights, but this came much later than, say, civil and political or economic, social, cultural. So when we are talking about the new frontiers of human rights, I think we are looking at the right to development, the right to peace, the right to solidarity, and many of these collective rights, and individual as well as collective. So it has the very individual dimension as well as the very collective dimension. Going on to 1998, we set up, the United Nations set up, and always at there was always member states asking for these things. A great majority of the member states, representing the greater majority of the people of the world, asking, and led, of course, by the non-aligned movement in Geneva and the Group of 77 and China in New York. So we had the setting up of the working group on the right to development, all governments, and then the first independent expert, that is Arjun Sengupta, as mentioned by Mihir, followed by the setting up of the high-level task force from 2005 to 2010. So all of this was a lot of energy from the United Nations, because somebody is fueling all this, the finances, the support system. Yes, we have experts, but the United Nations that is, supporting these experts in every way, financially and otherwise, through research and many different ways. Then, of course, we had the 25th anniversary in 2011, and we really made that a moment. It was a real momentum in time to reinvigorate the right to development. We made every effort as an office to, first of all, because there's a huge knowledge gap on the right to development, like none of us seem to know. We were all doing right to development in different ways, but we didn't know almost that it existed. So it's like that for most of the people, even human rights lawyers. Many people don't know about the right to development. So, addressing and redressing that knowledge gap, putting out publications, fact sheets, a 500-page book, the declaration itself, etc., etc. So that was 2011, and then several years later, more efforts on the part of member states, and then the United Nations, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the General Assembly in New York. We had then on an annual basis, the Secretary General and the High Commissioner do report to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly on the right to development. And then we had a special rapporteur being established. The post of a special rapporteur was established in 2016, and a few years later, the expert mechanism on the right to development. So you see, there is a huge enthusiasm, a huge political will on the part of many member states who are representing many people to move forward with the right to development in terms of standards. We had the chair rapporteur was asked to make a set of standards, and he made a set of standards. Then the expert mechanism, they are doing great work. They are producing studies and doing a lot more research and country missions and to conferences and so on. And I will not touch on the covenant because that I can leave to Mihir. But so to say, this is another huge momentum for the right to development to move forward, because it's, when I look back from 1966, when Doudou Thiam, Foreign Minister of Senegal in the General Assembly, first said, we need, like Mihir said, a disruption. He actually said a revolution. He said, we need a revolution in terms of international economic relations. International economic relations, meaning trade, debt, all of them were so unfair that he asked for a revolution. And I think it's step by step of that little disruption or revolution that we are seeing over the decades, over the years, now culminating in the convention, which has just been moved to New York. And let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Shyami. Absolutely. It was helping us to see how this right more and more replied to the need of history, right? It became the tool that the history can use to reply to the needs and the request of equity and fairness of the populations. Go straight to, as you suggested to me here, and said you played a really key and crucial role in bringing forward the covenant. If you can tell us briefly challenges and perspectives for this covenant, and how you see an approval and endorsement of this legally binding instrument can change again the approach to development. Thank you.
Thanks, Davide, again. And well, let me begin by saying that the call for the elaboration of a treaty on the right to development emerged because the Global South is fed up. It's fed up of the existing status quo for a number of years, since the end of colonization, so to speak. As Maria pointed out, when the 1986 declaration was adopted, 146 countries overwhelmingly voted in favor, and that included even countries in Europe, for example, Spain, Italy, all voted in favor. 8 countries abstained, and only 1 country opposed it. No prizes for guessing. That was the United States of America. Why I point this out is because it's important to remember that since then, however, the right to development has been unanimously reaffirmed by all countries in over 25 important resolutions, declarations, agendas, and even the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Climate Agreement singles out the right to development in its preamble and says measures taken by states to combat climate change must be done in a way that respects and promotes the right to development. Okay, so there's no doubt today that right to development is unanimously agreed upon. Where the frustration is of the Global South is because despite all these numerous resolutions, declarations, agendas, even agreements adopted over time, the real operationalization of the right to development on the ground has not materialized, has not effectively materialized. And if you take a look at the last 2 preambular paragraphs of the draft covenant, it makes it very clear that despite the adoption of all these instruments, it has not been effectively operationalized, and now therefore convinced that nothing else will work, we need a treaty on the right to development. Now, the treaty itself, the draft covenant on the right to development, and I'll say something on the choice of the words covenant as well in the closing, is really, it adds a lot of value to the existing human rights instruments. It's the first one that actually categorizes obligations of states as obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill, which none of the previous human rights treaties do. But as we know, this is how we have managed to we have developed the international human rights system accordingly. It places equal attention and value to the obligations of states internally, externally, and collectively. It frames right to development both as an individual and collective right, and it stresses on the duty to cooperate among states that both Shyami and Maria have alluded to. And also importantly, it recognizes duty to respect human rights on non-state actors, including business corporations, and also duties on international organizations themselves. So in a way, it fills in very gaping gaps that currently exist in dominant narratives in international human rights law. Where do I see this going next? There are obviously political ideologies that play a role in perpetuating a split between the global north and the global south on whether the treaty is the right thing to go ahead with or not, right? Because the European Union's argument, for instance, is that we accept the right to development as a human right, but we don't think that the treaty process is the right way to go ahead with it. And the global south says that, look, we have been hearing this for years now. We have had all these agendas, the 2030 agenda, nothing seems to change. We need a treaty. But then there's also a political ideology, which I think reflects a very Eurocentric understanding of human rights, which comes from the global north. For example, the European Union's argument is that we accept the right to development, but only if it is understood as an individual right, not as a collective right as well. We accept it only if it includes or limits itself to the obligations of states internally, so no extraterritorial, no collective. And we don't accept the obligations of non-state actors, even to respect human rights, even businesses. Now, if you kind of reflect, where does this come from? And you will notice that it reflects a big gulf between how human rights are understood in the European tradition, as reflected, let's say, in the European Convention on Human Rights, and human rights understood in the African system or even the inter-American system. I'll give you examples. In the European Convention on Human Rights, only individual rights are recognized. There's no collective right. Not even the right to self-determination is mentioned in the European Convention on Human Rights. You look at the African Charter, it is not just individual rights, but collective rights as well. The inter-American system recognizes collective rights as well. If you take a look at the European Convention on Human Rights, you will notice that obligations are predominantly internal obligations, and that's what the jurisprudence has been based on to a large extent. I mean, there are some exceptions here and there, but to a large extent, it's inward looking. Whereas the African Charter and the Inter-American Charter focus also on joint duties of states, collective obligations. They focus on the duty to cooperate, solidarity rights as well. If you take a look at the European Convention on Human Rights, obligations are limited to states. Non-state actors or even individuals don't have duties as such. Whereas although in the European system, businesses can go to the Human Rights Court and say, my human rights are violated as a corporation, let's say to non-discrimination, but they don't have duties under the European system. If you take a look at the African Charter, there's an entire chapter devoted to obligations of non-state actors. In the American Convention on Human Rights, you have an entire chapter. It's one provision, but there is a chapter on duties and responsibilities of non-state actors. You don't find that in the European Convention. So the approach of the European Union to the right to development reflects a political ideology which is shaped by a very Eurocentric understanding of human rights. Again, to a large extent, it also reflects the prioritization of civil and political rights over economic, social, and cultural rights. I mean, as we know, the European Convention, which is enforceable before the court, is civil and political rights. Economic, social, cultural rights has its charter, but it's not the same level of enforceability. But that's not the case in the inter-American system or the African system. And this has played out in the negotiations on the covenant. Now the stage is that the draft covenant has been transferred by the Human Rights Council on the 14th of October, so very recently, to New York, to the General Assembly, because that's the only forum where all countries are represented and they can adopt the text of a treaty. The Human Rights Council is only 47 states, so they don't have that mandate. In New York, now a process has been set in motion for consideration of the final draft covenant, for negotiations if necessary, and its subsequent adoption. Okay, so it's not going to restart from zero. It's this final draft covenant that is going to be the basis for the negotiations to begin. We will most likely see a split there. I should point out at the same time that the European Union is not a homogeneous entity. There are lots of different interests. We do have a sense that some of the countries may have a soft corner for the right to development and the covenant, even in Europe, as against some others in Europe, so on and so forth. So my best estimate is that it will take about 2 years for the treaty to be adopted, and it will take another 3 years for it to come into force. So I'm giving myself about 5 years for this process to culminate. The draft covenant requires 20 states to ratify for it to come into force. So once adopted, I can easily see that 20 countries will ratify it rather quickly. So I can stop there, and we can have a further discussion later. Thank you.
Well, this is absolutely. I think this gives hope to the fact that there is a process ongoing. Before going. Maybe Mara, I see you are already unmuted. Do you want already to say something and comment on this? Oh no, sorry. What I like is that what I see is the human rights system, as you highlighted, is based on epistemic unjust system that silence a certain vision of the world and privilege what we intend as a Western approach, right? The potential of the right to development to de-silence this approach to the right to have a different pluriversality of vision of the world is massive, and I like that you can time these and the effect of having a covenant, and this gives me hopes, because as I said, the process was long, and this can be a very important step forward. So thank you, and thank you for the work that you are doing on this. But we are 3 minutes over time, so I really ask Mara. I think you already expressed very well the perspective of the civil society. I mean, of the people on the ground. What I want to ask you is how you feel is the civil society and the organization as Pope Paul XXIII and New Humanity can contribute to this process of bringing the voice of the civil society into this process of promoting the right to development.
Yes, as I said before, unfortunately, in the world, many NGOs and civil society organizations are focusing on development, but not on right to development, because it's not yet known, and there are also prejudice, because when we speak of development, we think of the development model which is imposed by Western countries, so even patient people on the ground are reluctant to embrace the issue of the right to development. So first of all, as a civil society, together also with the United Nations experts, we have to sensitize, and also the OSHR session on right to development, enlarging the cadre of civil society people which can be involved. Here in Geneva, as Pope John XXIII, is already 14 years that we are focusing on the advocacy for the implementation of the right to development. I think very strongly and very constantly on this issue. And we are also coordinating within the Geneva Forum, the Catholic NGOs Forum, a group on the right to development composed of 12 NGOs. And there is also New Humanity and Caritas and others and so on. And for example, during the working group on the right, the intergovernmental working group on right to development that we have always followed throughout the years, I'm the spokesperson also of these 12 NGOs. But not only at the Human Rights Council, we send our joint statements, oral and written statement, also to other NGOs that are keen to advocate on the right to development. So we try to enlarge our network. We have sent contribution on the criteria, operational sub-criteria to the right to development. We have sent contribution on the set of standards in the working group on right to development. We sent 3 contributions for the international covenant, the draft international covenant. Mihir Kanade knows very well, because I'm glad that many things that we said have been also incorporated in this important document. So as a civil society, we should remain focused on this advocacy. And now that it's shifted in New York, being based mostly in Geneva, we have to find ways also of spreading the news and try to advocate at that level. I don't know, we have to discuss and to find ways, because time is important, and we hope that the adoption of the International Covenant will be speedy, because the poor of the people cannot wait. and this is fundamental. Yeah.
Thank you, Mara. I think you highlighted very well the fact that right to development needs to be supported at the institutional and non-governmental level, at people's level, and this should also impact on the way we perceive development. Right, the right can lead, in this sense, a redesign of what development is. We have to conclude. There is a question that I think goes into the depth of the law related to these. That is, mentioned people with jurisdictional limbo, like refugees, and I think we all experience the tragic tragic reality of these people. I'm sure there will be a time for answering to these via email or in other circumstances. So what I'd like, I thank you, the 3 of you, very much, absolutely, for giving us such a passionate and very competent overview on the right to development, that more and more it looks to me being a commitment, a change of gear toward equity and justice, and a more inclusive development process. And I can say now that right to development represents a real new frontier from human rights. So I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to the Sophia Institute, to the Fordham University, to the University of Valladolid for organizing these. I realized that I haven't introduced myself at the beginning. So like in the good disc, there's a Thailand disc, BBC Radio 4, I conclude presenting myself and saying, this is Davide. I'm a postdoc researcher on decolonizing global health at Oxford University and the Wellcome Trust Center in Kenya. I thank you for the time we spent together tonight discussing new frontier of human rights and looking at the potential and the reality of right to development. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you again, Mihir, Shyami, and Mara, for being with us tonight. And I'm sure there will be a future opportunity to continue this very, very, very interesting conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.